Does it make sense to maximize liberty in the economy, but yet to limit liberty at a personal level? Check it out.
When I'm operating in the market economy, I want maximum liberty. I just want to maximize my economic efficiency with no constraining factors. But then in my moral personal life, I'm willing to submit myself to some inefficiencies because, to be very blunt, I'm not going to euthanize my aging parent because it costs a lot to take care of them in long-term care or to provide in-home services for them. I'm not looking to maximize my efficiency in that area of life. But somehow when it's just about market and economics, I'm willing to. It's an incoherent way of living, and I don't think it actually is attuned to human nature.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Watley, and today we have Alex MacDonald with us. Alex is a public policy and government relations expert. He's a writer, a political advisor. He's a former political staffer for Jason Kenney and Erin O'Toole. He is currently Associate VP at Council Public Affairs in Ottawa. I ran across Alex when he wrote an article for Without Diminishment, and it was on fusionism. Great thinker. Clearly, he has a ton of experience that he's applying to the questions that we're dealing with today. How do we juxtapose economic liberty and social continuity and the preservation of a culture and celebrating what we've inherited? How do we maximize wealth within a society to the end that that's even possible, while also maintaining some sort of sense of culture, social norms, traditions, and that sort of thing? Our discussion focus on how people are experiencing this world. What is it like actually to live in a world where the only thing that matters, or the thing that matters the most, is economic productivity, efficiency, utility? At the very end, I shouldn't have thrown this question at him, but I asked him about the monarchy. I know that Alex has some good thoughts on the monarchy, and he appreciates it beyond simply an academic appreciation. And so I said, well, do we even need the monarchy in Canada anymore? And of course we do, but it wasn't fair to spring that on him at the very end, but he answered it well. He's clearly thought a lot about it. Had a lot of fun with this episode. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I also have a Patreon account now too, but anyways, let's get on with the show. Alex MacDonald, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sean.
Thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it. In the intro, I had a hard time summarizing all the things that you've done. And so it's fascinating when someone like you with your experience writes a piece. And I'm thinking of the piece when I first found out about your name. You wrote it, I believe, for Without Diminishment. And you talked about fusionism. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that a bit for us. Tell us why you wrote it. What are the good things about fusionism? Maybe we'll start there. And you could talk about the bad things too if you want. But tell us about your piece on fusionism.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Sean. I've I've been I would say, astute follower and reader of Canadian politics for a while, but also in my professional life, I'm advising clients and helping people to try to understand how politics impacts their corporate affairs. Um, so I've been following quite intimately the kind of, I would say, emerging debate that we're seeing within the conservative movement, an intra debate. And I think some of the fault lines that we're seeing come to the forefront of that discussion are captured within that older conversation about fusionism, which, for a more generic sense, it was popularized in the United States through the National Review, figures like Frank Meyer and Bill Buckley. On the Canadian side, folks like Sean Speer have written quite extensively about it, and more recently, gentlemen like Sam Routley, both whom you've had on the show. Simply put, in the way that I express it in my piece, is that it's an understanding of the conservative coalition in North America, or an Anglo-conservative more broadly, in which we see a coming together of social traditionalists and economic libertarians, generally speaking. And what fusionism purports itself to be is, I think, not just a marriage of convenience of two political sects for electoral gain or to make an electoral bargain. Yes, that's happening, but there's actually something much more deep that's going on, much more intellectual, philosophically grounded, that the interests of the economic libertarians, free market orientated, a stronger emphasis on liberty, and to some degree order, can be fused with or brought together to complement the social traditionalist or social conservative, whatever you'd like or are most comfortable with, their more kind of freedom and virtue orientation. It's not to say that the social conservative or traditionalist doesn't care for the economy, but has perhaps a wider view of politics, of the state, of what they cherish. And so Fusionism offers an elegant way of understanding why and how that coalition came together, how it continues to function or not function. And I think some of its most strident including Stephen Harper, have made the argument that, well, we conceive of it as two camps or two different types of people that oftentimes, and more often than not, they would argue, they happen to be the same person, meaning that they would contend that someone is often economic libertarian, they emphasize free market principles, but they also have socially traditional values that they're operating with. I contest whether that's actually the case today in Canada, whether it's even possible philosophically for one to operate that way. But the good faith argument of Fusionism, to kind of summarize, is that at its best, it's the coming together of these two brands of conservatism for mutual ends, that it's actually, as some have called it, a marriage of mutuality, in which these values are self-reinforcing and mutually beneficial, and that it fuses into a coherent political ideology that can be electorally viable and successful. And I think those that are clear adherents to this and popularize it, say that Stephen Harper is probably one of the best examples of governing with that fusionist ideology, appreciating it and allowing it to guide his tenureship as Prime Minister of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I've often heard it said that we're trying to achieve conservative ends using libertarian means. And so we're going to use this market to achieve these wonderful social outcomes. Is that more of a dream, or has that turned out to be reality?
Yeah, another excellent question. I think it's a hopeful aspiration. My contention would be that it's too narrow and that human flourishing can't be defined just by economic well-being. And so therefore, to ascribe oneself to a market dominant view of human flourishing, that, you know, a well-functioning market, well, it can provide for material comfort and is, I think, undeniably the best means to doing so and to offering economic prosperity. Economic prosperity is not synonymous with human well-being. And I think that's where one of the rubs within this fusionist debate really occurs, where the economic libertarian would naturally and coherently argue for more liberty within one's economic life, to achieve greater prosperity and therefore to achieve greater material comfort. And I think the social traditionalist can appreciate that, wants kind of an additive function to the conversation, saying, yes, but there's more to it. And we shouldn't have such a purist attitude towards the market, because the market, in all of its efficiency and productive ability, can also pervert and distort and degrade the human person. Of course, the economic libertarian would say, well, that's bad forms of capitalism, not good forms of capitalism. But this is where, you know, again, to go back to those that have popularized fusionism, especially in Canada, and I'm thinking of Stephen Harper, and I quote this in the piece for Without Diminishment, his 2003 speech at the Civitas conference, in which he called for a rebalancing. And I think that framing is very important in that it harnesses the elegance of fusionism properly understood, which does not put the market libertarian, the economic libertarian, and the social traditionalists in a binary tension. But he really does try, or he did advocate for that mutuality. And yeah, I think we have to leave more space. We have to balance in favor of a more holistic view of the human person, of what human flourishing entails. Um, and that's a wider conversation. And I think one of the critiques that I bring up, whether implicitly or explicitly in the piece, is that essentially in the current intra-conservative debates, I think the economic libertarians continue to prove that the balancing, the rebalancing has either not occurred or they're actively arguing against it by continuing to argue for a pure form of economic libertarianism, or claims that, you know, culture war, identity politics, whatever you want to call it, but a focus on social value questions in politics is ultimately stream from economic realities. Solve the economic stagnation problem, increase economic productivity, and these social value questions will solve for themselves in due time. And I think that's too narrow, and I don't think that offers the balance that fusionism promises, or that it tries to facilitate. And I don't think if you could call it this, the modern fathers of fusionism in Canada saw it that way either.
Yeah. It almost seems to me, and I was sharing this with you before, that we're talking about outcomes versus ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we look at fusionism as a way to think, and if you keep that in mind when you're reading Stephen Harper's address to Civitas in 2003, it seems like he's saying, well, these are two modes of thought that are important to keep in mind at the same time. He's not focusing on outcomes, policy changes, or legislative adjustments. He's talking about ways of thinking. Whereas most of the discussion we're having today seems to be more emphasizing outcomes. Do we get great economic outcomes, or do we have social cultural outcomes? And when you have that debate about outcomes versus ways of thinking, it's almost like talking about what does your smoothie look like depending on the contents you put in the smoothie. In the summertime, we make lots of smoothies in our house. So you put in yogurt and you put in whatever ice cream or whatever you want. But if you add frozen berries that are full of blueberries, you're going to have a dark blue purple smoothie. No matter how much yogurt you put in, it's going to be dark blue purple. If you put in kale instead of blueberries, it's going to be like a really disgusting green color. It'll taste great, but it'll be green. And so when we talk about outcomes, when we blenderize these two things, one ingredient ends up dominating the outcome. Now, that's just me saying this. What do you think of that analogy? Is that legitimate to maybe think of this as modes of thought versus outcomes, and how some outcomes you simply can't mix them together because one of the ingredients will dominate the other just by the nature of the ingredient itself?
Yeah, I think that's a quite useful analogy, Sean, and it speaks to a point that I made in the piece, which is kind of more on the side of the way we think. I kind of take to task this idea that the economic libertarian and the social traditionalist can be one and the same person. It seems odd to me that one could argue for maximal liberty within their economic affairs, that is to say, unrestrained economic activity that is not mediated or constrained by considerations of to a certain extent, moral ethics or virtue. Then at the same time, in their personal life, they somehow have an appetite for being constrained by traditional forms of morality, which is to say a virtue ethic. Can a person live a coherent life by compartmentalizing themselves as such? I don't think so. I don't think most people are comfortable living that duality. This also kind of touches upon it, questions of conscience, for example, and the role of faith in public life, or just moral ethics in public life, is that I think the intelligent observation and conversation is that it's harmful to the human person to ask them to compartmentalize their life, to not be conscientious in their professional obligations, instead to serve some supposed higher goal of neutrality or of respect for other people, not imposing, and so forth. So I think it's right that when we look at the modern Conservative Party in Canada, that we've seen a dominance of economic libertarian ideals and arguments. Now, some people that have either directly or indirectly responded to some of these arguments, whether made by me or those that are sympathetic with it, would say, "Well, haha, this is news to the libertarians who don't feel like our politics, our economy, or even the Conservative Party is all that libertarian." I think that's an objectively true statement, but I'm making a relative judgment, which is who has fared better in this marriage between economic libertarians and social traditionalists. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that economic libertarians have won the day fairly consistently, and not just because social conservatives have lost, but because when we look over time, whether it be in the Harper era during governance or subsequently under different Conservative Party leaders, the Conservatives have employed an electoral strategy and communications that is largely focused on pocketbook issues, which is, say, economic matters in the economic life of Canadians. It's a much more neutral ground for them to wage electoral battle over. It's less contentious. I think it also speaks to the often self-conscious nature of conservatism in Canada, that we tend not to want to take bold stances on divisive cultural, social, moral issues out of fear that we take up the losing side of the argument and we wash away our electoral opportunities as such. So I think we see that, like, the libertarian mindset is not just constrained to economics, but that it goes beyond that, because whether historically or in the contemporary moment, these conversations that we're having, it's not strictly that I just want libertarian principles in the functioning of the market, but now we're seeing them bleed also into questions of state neutrality vis-a-vis culture, or even to a certain degree about pluralism. I think you can argue that there's a dominant sentiment of kind of neutrality in general, of favor of liberty in general, rather than entertaining conversations about moral ethical stance, about the legitimate and necessary choices that the state has to make that have moral implications. And I think we see a general discomfort within mainstream conservatives to deal with that head on. And I think that speaks to this reality, to bring it back to the analogy that you put forward, Sean, that if the economic libertarians are the blueberries in the smoothie, then they've really colored it. So yeah, I would say that then, and I think I kind of blended both the conceptual and the outcomes based there.
No, well said. I've written down philosophically possible, and I've circled it many times. So we're going to come back to that. Don't worry. We're not going to leave that on its own. But I do want. I'm always looking for some way to gently argue with you. So I don't I don't fundamentally disagree with almost anything you said. But I'm always looking for a point where, okay, how can we turn this into a tennis match a bit? And so I want to take the libertarian position, specifically on our approach to healthcare in Canada. So that's my background, and I thought for sure I was an anarcho-capitalist because I wanted to burn the whole thing down. But then I realized, well, wait a second, I don't really want to burn the whole thing down. But to use that as an example, I often hold up Mike Harris, and people love Mike Harris, the conservative of the conservative. And he did so much good for, I'm sounding sarcastic. He did do a lot of good, so we'll just leave it at that. But on healthcare, I couldn't disagree more. The only good he did was cut spending, and that's why the fiscal conservatives thought he was so wonderful. If you read the book, The Harris Legacy, is just out a couple of years ago, and you read his chapter, written by Will Falk, on healthcare. And Will kind of tongue in cheek, but gives Harris just accolade after accolade about what a great central manager he was and how he would close hospitals here and shift services to another place without even talking to the people on the ground, saying, nope, yeah, you've spent your life doing vascular surgery at that hospital. Too bad. You're going to another hospital. You don't know the people you're working with. You don't know the nurses you're working with. You don't know the facility you're working with. Who cares what that means for patients? This is what we're doing because it's fiscally responsible. And so he was a master central planner. And this is Will Falk saying this, who's very much a liberal voter, a liberal mind. And he's congratulating Mike Harris, our conservative of the conservative in Canada, for his dominance and control from a central planning perspective. So he was the opposite of a libertarian free market economist on healthcare. And so I'm wondering whether you would temper your comments about saying the blueberries have won and they've colored everything. Uh, Perhaps it's issue by issue. I tend to agree with you that the economic libertarian mindset has dominated the larger conservative movement in Canada. However, it seems like there are specific and notable policy areas where they have not at all. It has been entirely central planning. Now you might say, well, that's not a social that's not what I'm talking about. That's not the kind of outcomes I want. That's just Eastern Bloc thinking. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are there. Can we have a little bit of empathy for our libertarian friends here?
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of case study example, if you will. I think we're on the precipice of something happening there. I think it's hard to judge in a way because the way in which the public policy of healthcare in Canada has been so sacrosanct for so long. It's been off limits to debate. So in a way, and I'm not trying to be cute about this, but in a way, it hasn't been up for debate. It hasn't been subject an exchange of views of how would we reform. What I would say though is that any conversation about reform of healthcare almost necessarily comes down to we need to expose Canadian healthcare to more market forces.
Hmm.
And I'm sorry, but that is an economic libertarian disposition. It's not to say that it's not true, but if that is the only consideration or the only policy mechanism broadly defined here, um, then I think it does speak to a dominant view. Or, if the first lever you want to always pull is more market, more market, more market exposure, then I think it does speak to like, what are your first principles? What is your disposition? This is not to put it in necessary tension with the social traditionalist. As I said, the social traditionalist is not anti-market, but it's just perhaps one way of looking at it is a more holistic view. Using market forces is one viable tool, but it's not always the most elegant or necessary tool. And in some instances, I think what the social traditionalist brings to the table that's important is to say, wait a second here, exposing this, that, or the other thing to market forces actually degrades this thing. It's to profane it. It's to only consider its value and utility in terms of economic measures or metrics. And I think a great conservative thinker that has spoken on this quite well is Roger Scruton, in trying to remind us that it's almost like a cardinal sin of conservatism if our only instinct is to pull the economic levers or to try to monetize or economize things. And that's where, again, to bring it back to some of the current debates that are going on, with particular attention to the debates around culture and the role of the state versus the individual and family. I find it interesting and maybe a point of confirmation to some of the arguments that I've made that those arguing for state neutrality in the function of culture, take for example Sean Speer, his impulse in critiquing some of these things has always been market forces. Let's just expose public institutions or publicly funded modes of cultural production, to market forces, to test them. Um, and I think that's where there's a bit of a tension or a bright line between what is the impulse and what is the disposition, and what does the person ultimately think is the best means for driving a different outcome. If it's always the market, or if that's the first lever you desire to pull, then I think it does show a pretty um, narrow conception of these things. It's not to call the likes of Sean Spear narrow-minded. I think it just speaks to one's disposition, and the tension being that a social traditionalist would have a more holistic view and maybe have more tools in the toolbox, if you will, that they're willing um, to use to achieve or to foster the desired ends.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I apologize. I didn't even warn you that I was going to spring that on you, so you handled it just like you're obviously a consultant, very, very smooth. The and vice president of your firm too. So there you go. So the comments on healthcare are so well taken, and I think that in part is what led me away from my what I thought were libertarian roots. Because when you actually start applying these ideas practically, for example, you have free agency. You're a rational being who can make choice. Okay, now you're bleeding on the side of the road. You can make a free choice about which ambulance service you want because it's a free market. Well, that's just ludicrous. You do not have agency. You've lost your agency. It just does not apply when people are really sick. And so my libertarian friends will say, well, no, no, of course you don't make the decision there. You make the decision before you arrive at that point. Yeah, but you can't anticipate all the decisions that have to be made before you actually get in that point of extreme vulnerability and a compromise of your reasoning ability and your free agency is compromised. And then building on that, spent too much time reading Alistair McIntyre's work, and he's saying that our system of norms and behaviors or virtues emerge from a group that are trying to aim towards a particular thing. So in healthcare, we're trying to improve patient care. We're all aligned in that direction. And that becomes the standard by which we judge our own behavior and the behavior of those around us. And so out of that profession emerges a set of social expectations, cultural norms. And if we just simply say we're going to reward whoever can move the most patients through and generate the most income, well, no, that destroys those norms. You can't, you have to have that fabric, standards of practice and ethical norms. Now, I'm often talking about referral networks now, and I apologize. This isn't supposed to be about healthcare. I go out of my way to avoid it, but I just want to support your point. Um, when we talk about making referrals, a number of many people on the left, but now even some people on the right are saying, "Oh, well, we just need to have a central referral agency. We just dump all the referrals into a big
Yeah.
bucket, and then a computer program sorts them out, or a bureaucrat sorts them out. Whoever has the shortest wait time." That's nonsense. People have really short wait times because no one wants to go see them. People with long wait times are the ones that actually listen to their patients, talk to their patients. They have good surgical outcomes. But I'm just trying to support your point that referral networks are based on relationships, and those relationships develop over time, and you get to know a surgeon or a consultant, and you get a sense of how they treat patients. And do I want to send my patient to Alex MacDonald? And I know he's technically pretty good, above average, but he's nasty. He's not nice at all. And he sends a note back and tells me to explain everything. So this is all to your point about culture, norms, social connections. We're talking about culture in a very normal way. It's part of all human interactions. So,
Mm-hmm.
so
But
well said.
if I may, Sean, you're making an excellent point, though, or you're drawing something out that I think is implicit in this conversation, but we should make explicit, which is that when I make these comments about the disposition of the economic libertarian to pull the economic or market lever, it it reveals something. It reveals principles or um, what they ultimately see as good, which is utility, maximization, efficiency. these are the metrics of success for them. The important thing of realizing that is that, well, all those things are good. They're also easily accessible because they're quantifiable and they're measurable. And what you're speaking to is a more holistic view of life, frankly, in the broadest scope, which there are unquantifiable things. There are things that are scrutinizable not by metrics, but also that utility, productivity, maximization of outcomes is not the ends of our life, or rather what most people strive for. We strive for it in an economic sense because we're motivated to fulfill our material needs. But it's a very narrow conception of our actual lived lives.
Mm.
And I think what the social traditionalist brings to this is an appreciation for, we could say kind of bluntly, the non-quantifiable. The analogy you're using about healthcare referrals and wait times, if we just look at, as you elegantly put, wait times, why are they short? It doesn't necessarily speak to excellence in service. There's much more going on there. And so we necessarily have to zoom out and appreciate these other realities that are going on. And I think the social traditionalist that does see a life that is more expansive than just the economy brings that richness to this discussion. And, again, to go back to Stephen Harper in 2003, I think, of course, I'm biased in that I have a stake in the more social traditionalist side, but I think when he was calling for a rebalancing, it was to say, yes, we need to rebalance in favor of the social traditionalists to not rob ourselves of the riches of that tradition, to put them at our disposal. It was also very much so importantly conditioned upon what he saw in 2003 as the largest threat to our communal life together, which was, in his words, moral relativism, cultural relativism that necessarily led to nihilism. We can, in these debates, intra-conservative party debates, we can, throw barbs back and forth. But no one really wants to talk about the moral relativism, cultural relativism, and pathway to nihilism that in very short order, I think we've gone down. So it's important not just to recognize what Stephen Harper was calling for, but what he was also trying to protect against.
Yeah.
And simply relying on market forces, on a market libertarian ideology, it will lead us to worship at the altar of the market, but we need to have a much more holistic view of the person and of our communal life together that can appreciate for the non-quantifiable, if I can put it that way, and wrestle with these questions of moral relativism, cultural relativism, and the like, which is not necessarily in the kind of confines of the market, but in our moral, ethical, social life more broadly, the social questions of our communal life together that necessarily come up and we're not spared from, certainly not today.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that we measure matters.
Correct.
So again, coming to defense of my libertarians, I didn't think I was going to take this position, but I think perhaps I'm coming to defense of my own misconceptions. When I was deep in, especially in healthcare leadership, all I talked about was, you said, utility, productivity, efficiency, because it was so bad. There were so many obvious places. And so I was trying to think of an analogy to use so that we're not just talking about healthcare, talking about broader social policy. It's like we're in a boat and we have a giant hole. What we desperately need at that moment is something to plug the hole or a bucket to bail out the water. And even though that is important, we still need something to eat in our boat if we're going to survive. And so you're saying starvation is also a concern. We could drown from economics, but we can also starve to death if we're not paying attention to that. And so that's a way, I think, of circling back to your comments about nihilism, social decay, lack of meaning and purpose. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that and tie it back to your philosophical comments. You said it's probably not philosophically possible to have a principled prioritization of the economy versus social concerns. They're coming from two different sets of philosophical principles. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that comment that you made and then maybe tie it into this moral decay, nihilism,
Mhm.
this sense of lack of meaning and purpose. And then tell me if you think the leaky boat versus starvation works in what you're talking about. So there, I've given you four questions and you won't remember any of them, so just say whatever you like.
Yeah, excellent, Sean. On the kind of management versus starvation point, I think what you're getting at, and I appreciate, is that we can get very wound up with kind of a kind of puritanical ideology, and that we want the perfect prescription for the problem, and we're willing to sacrifice a lot of maybe short, medium term things along the way to satisfy that. We're willing to ascribe to ourselves a lot of purity tests in the way in which we go about solving these problems, and um, I don't like it's not to be disregarded or to condescend those things. There's a nobility in wanting to be ideologically coherent, but then there's the practical lived realities of how we get there. I think that's where some of the conservative tradition and impulse of more incremental change over time has a lot of merit in that it kind of dials in our expectations appropriately because we have an appreciation for reality, and we tend not to be radical, or at least we as conservatives are radical in only a few occasions and when absolutely necessary. Because again, it's not a purity test of conservatism is never radical. That would be kind of an incoherent way of thinking about it. We're incremental insofar as we can be incremental. Um, so there's certainly something there on the philosophical kind of question of whether fusionism can actually work in practice. I think my primary concern there is that I think the human person naturally longs for and seeks unity. To put it in simple terms, again, I don't think it makes much sense to say, when I'm operating in the market economy, I want maximum liberty. I just want to maximize my economic efficiency with no constraining factors. But then in my moral personal life, I'm willing to submit myself to some inefficiencies because I recognize that utility maximization is not the ultimate ends. To be very blunt, I'm not going to euthanize my aging parent because it costs a lot to take care of them in long-term care or to provide in-home services for them. I'm not looking to maximize my efficiency in that area of life. But somehow when it's just about market and economics, I'm willing to. It's an incoherent way of living, and I don't think it actually is attuned to human nature. I think we see we actually see moral decay when people are acting in an incoherent or inauthentic way. And maybe that's the way of putting it, is that it's inauthentic, and
Mhm.
that we have these virtues that we're willing to ascribe to in our personal life, but then in the market we're unwilling to entertain those constraints. And again, I think it does come down to a question of prioritization and first principles. The within the market, um, properly understood, like, it is about right allocation, efficiency, maximal utilization, etc. But there are unintended consequences to all of that, and even foreseeable consequences that a more market libertarian driven person is willing to assume, um, but might not actually do so in the kind of
Mhm.
micro sense of their life. Um, and then maybe to tie this into moral decay more largely, which is, say, if we sit back and look at our communal life together, if we're not willing to accept that the end goal of our life is not necessarily maximum productivity, um, then we are necessarily ascribing to a moral ethic of life. We're ascribing to an appreciation for non-economic goods in our life, and I think that does, or it ought to, temper our view of the state, what it's for, what is our communal life together for, how do we interact in the public square with one another? Is this just a transaction amongst people that happen to live in the same country? I pay my taxes and I expect my health care to be efficient and provided to me. I expect other public services to be provided efficiently. Or is there more to life than just that transaction? I think we're enduring a social moral decay because we have allowed for a view of society that is more individualistic and atomized and incessantly focused on material comfort and well-being at the expense of almost everything else. Volunteering one's time, for example, participating in a civic association, these are non-monetary ways of spending one's time. They're almost inherently inefficient in terms of one's economic view. I could be working longer at the office. I could be doing a second job. But no, I choose to do something that's non-economic. I choose not to live optimally from an economic point of view to achieve other non-economic ends in my life. It's I find it quite ironic that there's this young generation that is incessantly focused on productivity, this whole like side hustle culture of, you have your day job, perhaps it's your main source of income, but you're also doing something on the side. And we allow it to be put into essentially positive terms, like I'm building something. It's always good to be building something, of course, but what are you building it at the expense of? Do you have a social life? Do you have a faith and spiritual life? Do you have a family that you're tending for? What are you giving up in pursuit of this maximal productivity? And is it worth it? If the only judgment of worth is economic well-being, did I increase my marginal net worth this year? Did my stock options go up? Whatever it is, did I reach my retirement savings goals? If that's the only judgment of worth of our activity, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing moral decay and atrophy and attenuation, because almost by definition, we're not attending to our social, cultural, familial bonds as we ought to. And of course, maybe some more economic minded person or an economic libertarian would say, well, in reality, this is all a consequence of the economy not functioning well, that someone can't provide for themselves sufficiently in a normal 40-hour work week, and so therefore they're forced into these other arrangements. And so really we just need a purer form of capitalism, a better allocation of goods, and so forth. And that's not wrong, of course, but what's the incentive structure that we've built in our society? And my contention would be that the materialistic, individualistic, dominant philosophy and social order that we've adopted leads one overwhelmingly to seek material satisfaction, which in the end will never fully satisfy the human heart. And so you keep going back to the same well of, I just need to make more, I just need to save more, I just need to produce more, because we've lost the ability to appreciate the non-material goods of life. And that's not all through necessarily free choice. Some of it's through circumstance. We can think about the deterioration of family life just in general, the rates of divorce and family breakdown that are basically, I think, robbing a lot of young people from an ability to appreciate what a good family life looks like. What does success outside of the market, outside of your 9-to-5 job look like if you were never given that gift of a stable household, for example, that you then seek to replicate, or you weren't brought into a faith community through your family, and so you actually don't know what it is like to participate in civic or faith life like that. and so forth. So I'm rambling, but hopefully that sufficiently or at least partially answered most of those questions that you proposed, Sean.
Is fantastic. And I ran out of space for taking notes on my page. So you made a lot of great comments. I wanted to push back a teensy bit when you said we're not radical. I think it was C.S. Lewis said that the most rational thing to do when you find yourself walking in the wrong direction on a road is to turn around 180 degrees and head back the opposite direction. So that's kind of pretty radical, right? And so, yes, I agree. Incrementalism, when that is the prudential approach, and I
Of
would
course.
say, 95% of the time that is the case. But there are times when we need to actually turn around 180 degrees, which will seem really radical to the people observing us. So just wanted to throw that out there. I wanted to circle back to your comments about decision, reason, measurement versus culture. I'll set that question up as a moral issue because I think there's more that we can pull out of that. But before we do that, I wanted to also comment on your thoughts about materialism. And I've seen some literature saying that perhaps we're even in a post materialistic world where consumerism definitely was the main drive for people.
Yeah.
But for various reasons, whether we got too much junk, and that's including poor people and rich people, we're just overwhelmed with junk and stuff that we often don't really need. I'm wondering whether at its core, we aren't looking at a fundamental moral issue where people are saying the way to human flourishing, the way to happiness is to have a neutral government, as much as possible to have a neutral proceduralism where we emphasize utility and measurement and process and policy. And this will lead to happiness. It has the greatest likelihood of creating the preconditions for happiness. And those of us on the cultural side are saying, well, actually, even if something is inefficient, even if there isn't utility maximization, those things on that side of the debate have a greater likelihood of leading to human flourishing and happiness. So you actually have two fundamentally opposed visions. They are both aiming at happiness and human flourishing, but they are diametrically opposed. I'm wondering whether or not you think we could make it that rigid of an oppositional situation. Because if we present it that way, we risk presenting it as a zero sum game. Either you're maximizing utility all the time, or you're on the other side of the equation saying, who cares about efficiency? So is it fair to frame this discussion as really a fundamental contest between different moral visions of human flourishing?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I think it is okay, and I think it is honest to put them in opposition to one another. I would maybe frame it a bit differently, because fundamentally, I don't think that you can put them on the same even footing, which will reveal my conception of life and core tenets of belief. Is that I think it's ultimately a division between freedom, properly understood, and autonomy. Freedom, properly understood, I would contest is the ability in line with one's human dignity to choose the good, whereas autonomy is pure choice. And to then add the layer of morality into that, its freedom would be the ability to choose a moral life that leads to human flourishing. The unbounded autonomy is to live amorally, largely speaking. It's not to say that the people involved in that are amoral. We are all moral. Uh, Through the dictates of natural law and our consciences, we are moral actors, in essence. The question, though, is whether we're willing to constrain our own action in accordance with our conscience, a properly formed conscience in line with our human dignity. And so I don't think that, well, if these two are in tension, I believe that they are, I don't think that you can say that they're both orientated towards human flourishing.
Hmm.
Because simple reverence for autonomy that is necessarily unbounded does not restrain itself to the dictates of morality, of a moral ethic life, of higher goods than just the ability to choose. I think we're seeing the fruits of that in our current cultural decay. We have we have experimented quite deeply with this. We are in a moral relativistic and cultural relativistic age that the primary good that our society is oriented towards right now is maximal autonomy. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we're seeing a lack of human flourishing. The traditional human goods that we would point to in a good life are vanquishing, or they're becoming much more difficult to sustain. Perhaps more bluntly, our culture is actively adversarial or hostile towards those human goods. And I'm thinking of family, of community, of traditional morality, of a simple conception of what the good life is, and the ability to act upon it and to pursue it openly. The degree to which we have allowed ourselves to move away from say stigma or shame in public life and our communal life with one another, out of reverence for non-judgment and autonomy, is, I think, an excellent example of the way in which we're actively making it more difficult to choose and to live a good life. This is where, kind of in parentheses or as a footnote, some of the strains of the intra-conservative party debate right now is kind of a more communitarian conception of conservatism versus a more libertarian conservative of kind of a leave me alone politics, of a minimal interfacing with the state and state institutions, and an aversion from the state dictating one's life choices at all. And in a fabulous piece for Without Diminishment, my friend Nolan Toscano wrote that it's a very appealing vision of politics because it doesn't ask very much of you. And I think that's such an incisive point. It's easy to say, just leave me alone with my family, leave me alone to choose my good life, to live a good life according to my terms. I don't want to face any shame or stigma relative to my neighbors. I don't want anyone else judging my life or my choices. Essentially, I don't want to be constrained. And, conservatives, I think conservatives that promulgate this, I think, are well-intentioned, but I think when you scratch below the surface, it very obviously becomes just a comfortable form of moral relativism in which we're not allowing anyone else to have a claim on how we live our lives. Whereas a more socially traditional understanding is that we have an inherited moral ethic tradition that's manifested through norms and our culture and customs, and even just our interpersonal relations with other people, and their willingness to say what you are doing, how you are conducting your affairs is not honorable, or is not going to make you happy. This will perhaps be quite contentious, but I think one very obvious public manifestation of this is no-fault divorce, in that we have made it very simple to leave one's spouse, whereas before this would have been unthinkable, and not just for moral righteous reasons, but because it was something that would have been socially ostracized, not just because it's a bad thing to do, but because you had committed to that person. There was an honor in upholding the fidelity of your marriage. And it was also conceived as a public social good that marriages remain intact, that even if it had become a loveless state, that there was still other goods than just one's feelings that had to be tended to. The good of the children to grow up in a stable family, or the good of the community that families stay together, and so forth. But of course, a conception of the moral social life that does not allow for divorce or easy divorce is like anathema in our civic life today. And I think that speaks volumes to where the moral ethical conversation has gone, and what we choose to publicly and personally value, and the degree to which we're were willing to submit to a higher order, to a higher authority, and to higher mutual goods in society, that when I tend to them, they're not just beneficial to me and my family, but they're also beneficial to my community.
Yeah. So I love how you found the weakness in that contest. That was perfect because you're absolutely right. I set that contest up as two people or two sides of a debate, both agreeing on human flourishing and happiness. Whereas you said, no, 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 that's apples and oranges. Not even apples and oranges, apples and turnips. They're two completely different visions of flourishing and happiness. So I'm glad that you pulled that out. When I was struggling earlier about, you mentioned autonomy. The word I was struggling for at the time, or the phrase, was expressive individualism. And that
Mm,
comes out of research from, I think it's Bella and Associates in the 1970s. But we're seeing that on steroids. I
yes.
am an individual, I'm autonomous, and I'm going to express myself. And you need to endorse the expression of myself. You need to celebrate it. Another fascinating thought, building on the autonomy idea, is the concept of free choice versus obligation. So, the liberal view of the world, again, philosophic first principles, would be that my autonomous decision, my ability to make a choice, is the most important thing. Whereas the conservative would say, okay, most of the time I would agree. Yes, you should not be forced and coerced to do some things. And there are obligations that are not voluntary in life. You
Yeah.
voluntarily decide to get pregnant, but once you have that kid, you're obligated. A whole bunch of choices are eliminated, and you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. That's a whole nother discussion. I wanted to get your thoughts on monarchy. Full confession, growing up in Thunder Bay, very much looked at the monarchy as kind of a waste of money, and what are they doing with all those fancy horses and parades and jewels and crowns. And I grew up, anyways, without a sense of the role of monarchy. And so I've come around to fall in love with, especially Queen Elizabeth. I thought she was a rock star. But to respect her as an individual, but then also to start to understand the purpose of that institution and what it means for Canada as something that I think is crucial to our whole approach to politics, to the way our society functions. So I've come around reluctantly to appreciate the role of the monarchy. But I still wouldn't call myself a monarchist in the sense of some people just, they've got their house full of plates and cups and saucers of Diana and all the rest. So, yeah, I'm not that. But as we're winding down, this is our second last question. I'm wondering if you could tell us whether Canada even needs the monarchy today. I've tipped my cards. I think we still do. But what would you say to people who say, come on, Alex, we don't really need the monarchy anymore?
Well, I would simply say if we don't have the monarchy, then we don't have Canada. And I think we need to be very serious about this in the sense that, well, to take a recent example, JJ McCullough had a recent piece on his Substack in which largely he was talking about a perception gap between what he called elite conservatives, kind of the punditry, commentariat class, and then the so-called common day, actually voting conservative person. And he pointed out the monarchy as something that conservative elites tend to focus on, to value, but that the common man who is voting conservative doesn't really think about or care about. And I don't think he's wrong, but I think this is entirely the wrong way to frame this discussion. In that, I don't think we should frame, or rather, I don't think we should judge a fundamental institution based on its contemporary relevancy. I think that actually degrades the institution itself and does us a disservice. And to be very blunt, I think we have good contemporary examples of organizations uptake this kind of weather vane relevancy test, and then it's a quick self demise to their own irrelevance. I'm thinking, for example, and again, your audience might find this contentious, but the Anglican Church, for example, that has, in the name of modernizing, of relieving itself from quote unquote modern prejudices and whatnot, has changed key traditions, what they consider to be marriage or qualify as marriage, also who they allow to be clergy within their church. This was all done in the name of modernizing and of remaining relevant to the culture. And what we've seen is actually that it led to further irrelevance, and that it did not actually satisfy those that they were trying to remain relevant to. And the point that I'm really trying to make is that this is a bad litmus test to subject our institutions to questions of relevancy alone. One could also, we were talking about marriage before. Marriage is a fundamental institution. One can easily ask, is it relevant today? Well, marriage rates are down. More people are divorcing than ever before. We've made it easier to have the fruits of marriage through different legal definitions and contractual realities and things of like common law and whatnot. So is it really relevant? Is it needed? Does it have utility? You could probably say to all of those things, no, it's not relevant. No, it's not proving to be of utility. And you can tack on to that, is it elite? Well, yes, to a certain degree. Those that are getting married and staying married tend to have higher socioeconomic status and whatnot. So perhaps it's becoming elite. But would we do away with marriage because it's irrelevant to society? I would say no. And so all of this is to go back to the question of, does Canada need the monarchy? Yes, we do. It's a fundamental institution of Canada. It's part of our ethos. And I'm not even just speaking of the practical realities that the king is the head of state, that all of our functions of government ultimately flow from the crown. It's embedded in our constitution and so forth. But I also approach this, I think, as a conservative in temperament and disposition, into recognizing that the crown, the monarchy in Canada, is an inherited institution. So who am I to claim that we ought to do away with it, even if it is seemingly becoming irrelevant? Moreover, I think that there's a lot that we can gain from having a kind of a simple reverence for the monarchy, one that was more perhaps accessible and commonplace in our parents' and grandparents' generation, not necessarily because they were any closer to the monarchy per se, but because they had a greater appreciation for it in their lives. It was perhaps more prevalent in society, and so forth. And what I'm particularly thinking of is that monarchy as an institution helps to shape us as individuals and as a society, in that it stands apart and it offers an example, the higher goods of life and of things to aspire to, like fidelity, of duty, of reverence, even to a certain extent, and maybe this is going too far for some, but kind of a hint of the divine as well. It kind of stands apart from our normal secular life. All of the pomp and circumstance of, say, a coronation or a royal wedding or a royal funeral, all of those traditions, they draw us in and they show us something that's quasi-sacred. And so it kind of makes us look higher. And I think that these things are few and far between in life these days. The things that call us higher, that inspire awe in us, inspire wonder, that do make us look to the higher goods and to appreciate them. Of course, within all this, you don't have to like the monarch. You don't have to have a high esteem for the royal family. Of course, they're creatures just like us. I think Queen Elizabeth II enjoyed a popularity that benefited her and that she was easily likable. But maybe I'm disproving myself in this, but it's certainly helpful when the monarch is likable and is a good example. And Queen Elizabeth II, of course, was exemplary in that way. And we have to be a bit more kind of, I think, serious in our interrogation of it, which is that this is more than just about kind of hereditary rights and and kind of unchecked power or whatnot, but it is someone that stands apart and assumes absolute duty and responsibility, is tremendously selfless, puts themselves entirely at the service of things that are bigger, larger, and more important than themselves. The preservation of the country, the protection of the Constitution, the furtherance of the national interest. All of this is a tremendous calling higher for us as individuals. So this is a long-winded way of saying, in summary, does Canada need the monarchy? Absolutely. Without the monarchy, we would not be Canada fundamentally. But I think as an institution, it also provides essential goods for our communal life together, but even at a personal level, and in inspiring and helping us to look higher. Um, it's a wonderful public manifestation of virtue, of public virtue.
So, given what you just said, I think I owe you an apology for asking you about the monarchy as your second last question. I just feel so ashamed. I didn't mean to minimize or denigrate the importance of the question,
Not
and
at
I
all,
like
Sean.
how well you're being gracious. But anyways, we'll have to do a whole podcast just on the monarchy. Now I feel super guilty. My problem is I've come around sort of from an academic sense to see the utility and the importance and the history
Yeah.
and all of that. And but the dignified aspect, Walter Bagehot's idea, the efficient and the dignified, and the monarchy is central for the dignified elements of our constitution, and it does lead to a kind of transcendence. And another thought
Hmm.
I had when you were talking about the idea, it involves our imagination. The word imagination has been monopolized by, well, Disney and Mickey Mouse. I love Mickey Mouse. He's great. And I love cartoons and the whole thing. But that's only a tiny part of imagination. That's imagination with respect to make believe. Imagination is a core part of being able to think at all. When we're talking here and I present a concept or you present a concept, we're immediately thinking, okay, what does he mean? What's the opposite of what he means? What are other things that are kind of like what he means? How could we build on what he means? So we're imagining intellectually all of this other stuff. And so an intellectual imagination is crucial just to be able to
Hmm.
talk. And then when you talk about running a country and having affectionate ties, it's another concept I've been wrestling with recently is, the dignified aspect of our constitution and then having an affectionate tie to this country, habits, norms, cultures, customs that we've inherited, and being honest about those attachments that we've inherited and thinking about how we can live our lives with those attachments, which includes the monarchy. So, anyways, I hope I got out of your bad books for asking you about the monarchy as the second last question. But my very last question, and you already know this probably, I ask everybody, what have I missed? What should I have asked you, or what were you really hoping to say that we didn't get around to saying?
Sure. If I may, just one more thing on the monarchy, if you'll allow me. And I know you'll indulge me because you feel so guilty for bringing it
That's
up
right.
late in the conversation. But I think it's important that we put it into historical context as well in our kind of lived civic life. So I live outside of Ottawa, in a smaller town, and my family and I go to the Catholic parish here in town. It's a beautiful 100-plus-year-old church that has served this community. Um, and when you walk into the vestibule of the church, there's these great big plaques, and it's the names of all the glorious dead from the two world wars from the parish. And inscribed on the top, kind of as a banner, is "For King and for Country." And while the monarchy may seem far off to us today, seeing these plaques and these names and these men that went before me and sacrificed for king and country, it's a very visceral reminder that the crown does call us higher. It unifies us. It imbues in us our own duty towards country, towards our neighbor, towards the higher goods of our common life together. And the absolutely tremendous thing is that some of the men from this community that went to die for their king and for their country almost certainly came from families that were at one point oppressed by this same monarch, or monarchy rather. And yet there's some sort of magnanimity, and people might criticize this sentiment as being too romantic, but I think we call this romanticism at our own peril, and that we should allow our kind of our heart and our conscience and even our imagination to be touched by these things, to be reminded that our ancestors, the men and women that built this country, were inspired to take up the call of duty, to serve under the banner of king and country. And that should be something that we reflect upon. And I'm grateful, for that small gesture that I get to experience every week in my life. So yes, it is dignified. It does call us higher. It asks us to transcend some of the mundane, and that's a great service. It's a great inheritance that we've received in our life today. And to get to the actual question, the closing question, what keeps me up at night? Well, I remain an optimist, generally speaking. I'm a Christian. I think the battle has already been won. So I don't want to come across as pessimistic in saying this, but I do worry about the country, the culture, the society that my children will inherit. We've talked a lot about moral decay, social atrophy. I'm quite clear-eyed that these issues are not going to be solved in my lifetime. I hope that we see some progress. I hope that we see some sanity return to certain discourses in our public life. But why I'm so inspired by these conversations, why I'm grateful for folks like yourself, Sean, that are curating these conversations, providing the space for them, is that I think they're absolutely necessary to our renewal, not just in our conservative movement, our little corner of the political conversation of the country, but indeed for the country as a whole. That we do have an obligation to honor the generations past, but also to look forward and to try to pass on a very strong, worthy inheritance to our children. And I'm quite worried about some of the realities that my children, your children, Sean, will inherit and have to wrestle with, and whether collectively as a society we are equipping them to handle those things, or we're actually burdening them with great problems. But like I said, I remain an optimist because I do sincerely believe that the battle's been won, but there's still some skirmishes along the way that we have to entertain.
Great way to end. Alex MacDonald, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Sean.